A little caveat here. I am not a Bisheva scholar. I've learned more about Singer in the last day than I've known in my whole life. And at the moment, I'm intensely boggled by speaking to all you people who are experts in the field where I'm not. My expertise, such as I have it, is in translation. Several of yesterday's speakers and also today, David has touched on Singer's methods of translation, from having other people translate his works at the very beginning, and then Singer transitioning to translating his works on his own with more or less help from collaborators or editors. Obviously, any translations of Singer after his death in 1991 have to go through an entirely different process, which David touched on, and that's what I'm going to talk about today. I'm not sure how much Jan has told this conference about his 2-volume publication, In the World of Chaos, Early Writings, which is forthcoming next year by Academic Studies Press. I know he mentioned it. This is, and I hope it's okay if I just say a few words about it. This is a 2-volume edition, scholarly edition of Singer's earliest published work, most of which was written in Warsaw before he came to America. And it includes short stories, sketches, memoirs, and criticisms. All of these writings, as far as I know, certainly most of them will be appearing in English translation for the very first time. So we have that to look forward to. Jan invited me to be part of the translation team, and I'm incredibly honored to be a part of this important project and a translator of Singer's short stories. So what I'd like to do is offer a little behind the scenes look at my experience of translating 9 of Singer's early stories. And I realized after a little too late to revise my talk as I was listening to yesterday's presentations that a good many people, I was going to say here in this room, not in this room where I'm sitting right now, there's only me, but in your room, quite a few of you are already translators. So I might be preaching a bit to the choir here. My academic background, absolutely none of which qualifies me as a Yiddish translator, is my PhD in the history of English with an emphasis on Old English, which I used to tell people once I started studying Yiddish about, I don't know, 6 or 7 years after I got my degree, is exactly like Yiddish. Old English is exactly like Yiddish. Yiddish isn't old and it isn't English, but other than that, they're exactly the same. Utterly true. But as for my background in Yiddish, I started studying the language seriously in 2007. I was accepted into the Yiddish Book Center's Translation Fellowship, as was already mentioned. My fellowship project was a collection of stories by Yona Rosenfeld, and this is my bit of shameless self-promotion. Jan Schwartz was one of the early readers of The Rivals, and he invited me to become a part of the Singer project, I guess, on the basis of what he saw there, which I assume he liked. So my goals as a translator of Singer is to produce a translation in colloquial, more or less contemporary English, one that is as faithful as possible to the original Yiddish, one that is engaging to Jewish and probably non-Jewish readers as well, and reflects the eeriness, earthiness, humor, and strange beauty of the originals. So how does translation work? According to a friend of mine who's obviously not a translator, the process is fairly straightforward. Just translate the words. And we've had many discussions about this. Obviously, and I probably don't need to convince anybody here, that is a huge oversimplification. So here's a very simple, straightforward example. Word order in Yiddish, word order in English are entirely different. Sie hat zurückgetragen dem Lamp, sich genommen Euston zu legen in Bett rein. Just a random sentence from one of the stories I've just translated. she has carried back the lamp herself, began to undress to lie in bed inside. Okay, that doesn't scan very well in English, and it's barely comprehensible. But word order, of course, is not the only thing that a translator needs to keep in mind. You know, so there's a whole thesaurus, many thesauri, full of words that have more or less equivalent meanings in English. What's the word you choose? She put down the lantern, removed her clothes before getting into bed, etc. I'm not going to read all these. You can read them more quickly yourself, but you can see here the great variety of choices that a translator can make. These are all possible choices, and I don't think any of them is intrinsically better than the other. So how do you choose? And probably the most important thing that a translator needs to be aware of is context. So not only the sentence itself, not only the paragraph in which the sentence appears, but the whole story. And David was just saying how, just telling the group how a sentence in the original story can actually shed a light and make us reinterpret the whole story, or make us interpret the whole story in a different way. And that's something translators need to be aware of. So we need to look at context. We need to look at word choice. Obviously, a simple example, lamp versus lantern, take versus grab, etc. We also need to look at the sounds of the words, that is the number of syllables, because and that fits into the rhythm of the phrase or the sentence. For example, very simple example, everyone set off, everyone set off, which is sounds a little awkward compared to they all set off, which is two I ams and that you know, that da 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 kind of rhythm that I think sounds quite nice in English. Obviously, you don't want the whole story to sound like iambic pentameter, but that doesn't work in present day English. But every once in a while, it's, you know, it's a satisfying sound. Alliteration, that is a repetition of consonant or vowel sounds. Alliteration is a repetition of consonant sounds. So for example, you know, damp windows as opposed to window panes wet with the dew, that repetition of W sounds. Again, you don't want to overdo it, but every once in a while, throwing in a little bit of a rhythmic feeling, or repeating a consonant or a vowel sound can make the English come a much more satisfying feeling to the reader. Repetition of words and phrases. Yiddish is notoriously wordy compared to English. There's a lot more extraneous words, I guess we say. They're totally necessary and meaningful in the Yiddish, but when you translate them directly into the English, we end up with a long and clunky and repetitive sentence that just doesn't work well in the English. So the translator needs to be very conscious of reducing wordiness without reducing it too far and changing the meaning. Punctuation, Yiddish sets off dialogue with an opening N or M dash. Do we do the same thing in the English, or do we use quotation marks? Yiddish uses ellipses more than English. So sentences tend to trail off, excuse me, in the Yiddish, which doesn't work too well. It works fine in the Yiddish, doesn't work so well in the English. So what do we do? So hundreds of other stylistic considerations and individual choices to make. I'm going to illustrate some of the most typical choices that a translator has to deal with a few short examples. And these are just typical choices. We'd be here all day if we couldn't go into everything, but we'd be here all day if I even went into more examples. So I find in my own translation work, the most difficult challenges of translating Yiddish in general, and all of which have come up in these Singer translations, break down into linguistic, cultural, and historical geographical areas. And these are probably not the only choices I could have used, and they're probably, and they're also not mutually exclusive. They tend to overlap. Again, these are just examples. So breaking things down one at a time, looking at typical linguistic challenges. And again, there's a lot more categories I could have put here, but these are just the most obvious ones that spring to mind, are register and idioms. So looking first at the register of the, Singer translations, there's a number of different area aspects we could look at in terms of register, formality, informality. That's usually what we think of when we think of register. But the time period of these particular translations, these stories, these early stories in the World of Chaos were published mostly in the 1920s, and a few of them in the mid-1930s. So should the translations reflect the period in which the stories were written, that is the English of the 1920s, or present day English of the 21st century, or some other time period? And the editorial decision was made to reflect the English of Singer's already translated body of work, that is to represent a mid-20th century American dialect, because that's the time period and the language of most of the work that's already been translated of his. Just a few examples. The Yiddish, marsh, meaning go away. It's an old lady yelling at the worms that have crawled out of her stove, which is a really horrible image that still sticks with me. And she's telling them to depart. The Yiddish is marsh. Okay. English slang, 1920s, which I've never heard spoken, but according to the dictionaries and Wikipedia and everything else, 23 skidoo. Okay. 1920s. Well, I don't think Singer would have said anything like that. And even if he had, certainly it's not recognizable to a 21st, well, it's laughable, even if it is recognizable to a 21st century reader. Fuck off, totally contemporary. Well, would this old lady be saying such a thing to worms or anybody? I don't know, but a little too contemporary, a little too slangy for a translation of Singer. So at the moment, we've settled on scram, a mid-20th century kind of working class expression that this particular woman probably would have used had she been speaking English instead of Yiddish. Idioms, huge area of controversy. What to do with them? Just a couple of examples. Oy vey, which shows up in one of the stories. As a matter of fact, this is fresh in my mind. I've just been dealing with it. What do we do with oy vey? Tema Rochel bursts into Labish Bear's room and wakes him up. She's just been robbed. And he jumps up and says, oy vey, Tema Rochel. How do we translate it? In older translations, oy vey tends to show up as woe is me. Well, what do we do? We have a couple of options here. We could leave it as oy vey, which is familiar to the contemporary reader. And I was going to do that until the editor tells me, well, it's a bit too laughable. It's a bit of a joke in present day, to many present day North American English speakers. So maybe doesn't quite set the right tone. Woe is me does not work. Does anybody here actually say woe is me? I didn't think so. So how do we translate? Leave it as it is. It's in Merriam-Webster's. Maybe it's a bit too jokey. Woe is me is out of the question. Change it to oh my God, or what the heck, or what the hell. Good grief maybe would work. I don't know. This is something we're still working out. The translation team is going to review that particular one. Here's another example from the same story. A scandal, if Zolazoi Leben, a scandal. Literally, I should live like that. Well, what the heck does that mean in present day English? I don't know. The dictionary translation of the phrase is something like upon my life, which is again, like woe is me, something that nobody says anymore. So what do we do? Well, I'll be a scandal. Well, I'll be How does that work to you guys?
No.
No? Oh, okay. Well, got to relive that one. Okay. Fine. I'm looking for feedback here. Here's another one of my favorites, meh. It's a Yiddish word. It's a good Yiddish word. It shows up in Mendel and Mocher's form. It shows up in Singer. It entered English in the 1990s when it was popularized by the TV show The Simpsons. So it's an old word in Yiddish. It's a new word in English. So when meh shows up in Singer, what do? Do we keep it? Or does it sound too contemporary to be used? Even though it's a good, I'm going to keep it. I'm going to keep it. Thank you.
Cherish your meh.
I love it. The Yiddish sentence is, where is it here? It's on my previous page. Aber der Malabed hat geantwortet mit a meh, which I translated as the Malamed answered with an indifferent meh. We're going to keep it. Okay, unless somebody on the editorial team strongly objects. Such a good word. Looking briefly at typical cultural challenges having to do with differences in culture between the Yiddish of Singer's world and 100 years later, a very secular, English-speaking, contemporary, modern world. There's a number of different cultural gaps we have to try to jump across in order to translate Singer's ideas to present-day English. So I'm looking at three typical cultural types of challenges. Again, there are more. These are just a few examples to do with religious references. For example, Shabbos. Wait a minute, I think I'm on to my next slide here. There we are. Shabbos, which is Yiddish, versus Shabbos, which is also Yiddish, but an English word. It's in Merriam-Webster's. I think we're going to go with Shabbos, S-H-A-B-B-O-S, versus Sabbath, which is the word I think that was used in previous translations of Singer and other Yiddish writers as well. I don't like Sabbath personally. It sounds kind of Christian, actually, because a lot of Christian denominations use the word Sabbath. They've co-opted it really to refer to Sunday. So I think we're going to go with Shabbos with an O, but again, the final decision will be made later, versus Saturday, which sometimes is appropriate. And to use in a Yiddish translation, when the characters in a story, when the story is particularly secular and something is just going to happen on this day. For example, a story by Yona Rosenfeld, not a Singer story, in which the characters are going to go pick up some photographs from a shop on Saturday. And this is not an activity that's normally associated with the Jewish Shabbos. So there I use Saturday. Otherwise, when there's a particularly Yiddish or Jewish religious reference, we'll probably use Shabbos. Here's another example. It's sort of a religious reference, but it's used not in a religious context, in a line in Singer, in one of the stories I'm translating, Epis Trace. It's used in a particular context to describe a bad smell. Okay, not necessarily anything to do with religion, but the word treif, of course, has to do with kashrut, which is a religious concept. So what do we do? And again, we have a couple of choices. We could keep treif, but how do we spell it? Because it does appear in Merriam-Webster's, but the spelling is T-R-E-F, which doesn't look right to me. So we could keep treif, or we could simply retranslate translate the word as meaning something disgusting. Okay, again, I'm a little on the fence there. What do you guys think? Non-kosher? That doesn't sound right either.
No, but fish are kosher. I mean, I think disgusting is good because the literal concept of treif has to do with an animal that has been slaughtered by another animal. It's something, right. It's not just that it's, the wrong species, it's something that's filthy. It's something that's pickled.
Well, what about stinky? What about stinky?
Nobody wants to be
Um,
reminded of stinky though. It ruins the translation because now you're thinking about something that's stinky and that disgusting is exactly the emotion that trafe is supposed to arouse.
That's what I thought. So I think we'll go with disgusting. Okay. Make a note of that. So anyway, these kinds of editorial decisions are still in progress. And this is the kind of thing that any translator, I notice all you guys jumping in. So this is really great. And this is where the translation community is really important because we can't go back and ask Singer. Another set of issues that comes up over and over again that we don't normally think of when we think about translation problems has to do with clothing and everyday objects, both religious objects and but not necessarily so, clothing and objects that were used 100 years ago but nobody uses them anymore, like I don't know, walking sticks, for example, which is pretty easy to translate, but the idea of men walking around with the freight of cultural connotations we don't have anymore. So in the good old days, 100 years ago, people used a walking stick. It was a mark of class. I didn't know that, and it took me a long time to work that out. So what do we do with things like that? The kapote, the Yiddish word kapote, which is a long coat traditionally worn by Jewish men. It's in Webster's as capote, which sounds like Truman or something Italian. I don't like that. He put on his capote. What the heck is that? Long coat maybe is the best thing to do. I don't know. Kaftan, the word is sometimes translated as kaftan, which to me sounds like a 1980s women's house dress, usually with flowers. That certainly doesn't work for me. Gabardine was recently suggested. I think we might go with gabardine, but
Nobody
again,
knows what a gabardine is.
What about a frock
frock
coat?
coat, maybe, but these people are not necessarily wealthy. And in present day English, frock coat sounds like something an English gentleman, wears to, I don't know, afternoon tea or something. So again, and it depends on the context of the story too. So if it was a wealthy Jew wearing a capote, maybe we could go with frock coat, maybe. I don't know. So
but every Jew had a capote. Not every Jew had a frock coat.
That's right.
They're capotes and they're capotes.
Right.
It might depend. I don't know, but we would have to take context into account for sure. I think we'd go and Singer is not writing about wealthy Jews in these stories, so that particular aspect didn't come up. But I think we might go with gabardine. Again, it might be gabardine in one story and long coat in another, probably not kaftan or capote. Shaitel is one that I've struggled with. It is, everybody knows what it is. I don't need to explain. It's in Webster's as shaitel, Sheitel. So presumably we could keep it. It's usually translated as marriage wig. Or sometimes
marriage
just
wig in context understood, because
yes,
it's only going to be a married woman that's going to be wearing it. So it's almost redundant.
Of course, wig sounds like a fashion statement. So I don't think we'd go with wig at all. Marriage wig, I don't know. There's going to be a glossary. And I guess we would just, I think it's okay to leave some things a little bit weird or a little bit ununderstandable to perhaps readers who are not familiar with the cultural context. Again, these are just the kinds of issues that come up and need to be discussed and decided. So I'm not necessarily coming up with solutions right this moment or saying that I've already come up with the solution. Things to consider. Currency is a big one in these particular stories. These are poor Jews who don't have very much of it, so it's often an issue. Gilden refers to the kind of money, the Yiddish is gulden, actually.
How should gilden be translated?
I don't know. I've had, it also depends on when the story, we know when the stories were written, but when were they set? So what currency was in use, and we assume the stories are set in Warsaw, but it's not always sure. It's not always certain. Singer doesn't always give the name of the city, so we assume it's Warsaw, but not necessarily. We know that his Yiddish is so full of Slavic influenced Yiddish words and sometimes downright Polish words that we know it's in Poland. But what currency were they using when? I don't know. Do we use zloty? Do we use the English GUILDEN? We'll probably just go with the Yiddish gulden, GULDEN, because the context always makes it clear they're talking about money. So we'll probably just use that. These are, again, just examples.
Rachel,
Yes?
can we go back to Shabbos?
Sure.
I mean, there is no word in the English language more goyish than Saturday. It is the absolute most goyish word. And I think that, you know, even if you're picking up your photographs or your dry cleaning on Shabbos, for a Yiddish speaker knows that he or she is Machal Shabbos.
Right.
So even if you're not observing Shabbos, it's still Shabbos.
Okay.
Even if you're transgressing. I think it has to stay Shabbos with the OS, because OS is how it's used in American Jewish English.
Yes, that as well.
SHABES is only good if you're literally transliterating.
Well, that's what I'm doing. Yeah, that's what I'm doing. The first example is the Yiddish transliteration. I'm not using the Hebrew characters. For one thing, my computer tends to mysteriously transpose the letters and it doesn't work. And I don't know. Now I understand that I think most people in the room can actually read them, but when I put the slides together, I didn't actually know that.
But I think it needs to stay Shabbos.
Okay, well, I mean, that's what we're going to do for the Yiddish, for the Singer translations for sure. So not a concern there. The Christian world, this is where things get rather interesting, as if they hadn't been interesting and edge of the seat grabbing onto your desktop the whole time. Goy is a really interesting word. As we know, it's a Yiddish word that's been borrowed into English. It appears in Webster's, but the connotations are quite different. Goy in Yiddish is a neutral word. It's not disparaging. It simply refers to, you know, somebody who's not Jewish, but not in a negative way, simply descriptive. But in English, the word goy, well, it's odd, isn't it? In English, if a Jewish person speaking English uses the word goy, it's usually disparaging. So we have to look very carefully at the context in which the word appears in Singer translations or in other Yiddish translations as well. Normally, we're going to go with translating the word as Gentile or possibly Christian. But if in the context, the word goy is used in a disparaging way, we might keep goy once in a while. And certainly it's a word that's easily understood by an English-speaking, non-Yiddish-speaking person, but we have to be very, very careful of the denotations and also the connotations of the word. Negative attitudes towards Christians. This comes up occasionally in the stories I've been translating and in the Singer stories as well. Not too often, but occasionally. Yiddish writers were, as we know, not always kind to their non-Jewish neighbors. And until fairly recently, many translators have simply omitted words and phrases that might offend their non-Jewish readers. So here's an example that I'm sure all of you, most of you in this room are very familiar with. Anita Norwich, who is here with us on this panel as a respondent, wrote in her book, Writing in Tongues, she described the censoring of a line in Saul Bellows' translation of Gimpel Tam. And the Yiddish is, Ot zot Ot sagt man doch, als der Jäusel hat den ganzen kein Taten nicht gehabt. Literally, people say that that little Jesus didn't have a father at all. And in Yiddish, the line does a couple of things. It expresses disdain towards Jesus by making his name diminutive and preceding it with a definite article. That little guy Jesus, I guess, would be one way to put it in English. And in context, in the whole context of the Gimple Tom story, implies that the a Christian story about Jesus's paternity is an unbelievably tall tale. Okay, so if we were to retain that line in the English translation, it would be something like, they say that Jesus fellow didn't have a father at all. And Norwich says, the English is a little too attentive to its imagined reader. And what she's saying here is the English of Gimple Tom, the translation, I should say, that leaves out this particular line. The English is a little too attentive to its imagined reader, too concerned about giving offense, and perhaps too polite. I don't think we need to worry as Yiddish speakers, readers, and translators any longer. I hope that times have changed, and we don't need to be as concerned about not airing our dirty laundry in public. We don't need to be as concerned about not offending the Christian world. And so when such phrases do show up in these early singer stories, we're just going to basically leave them in. We're going to try to avoid, well, not try to, we're basically just going to avoid censoring singer by leaving things out. I should say it's not just the Christian world. References to the Christian world that might be offensive to present day readers. Its attitudes towards women is something that comes up again and again in translating Singer's stories and other male Jewish writers as well. What do you do? And I'm a big believer in leaving the stuff in, even when personally it annoys me. But what can you do? It's what they wrote. Typical historical and geographical challenges include things like place names, people's names, and titles. And again, these are just editorial decisions that are in process and need to be made. Place names, auf der Wolve. This comes up in Singer a couple of times. The quotes are in the original Yiddish, on the Wolve, whatever the heck that means. And that took a lot of digging out, but it turns out to be a street name in Warsaw. So we could keep the Yiddish up there, Wolve, on the Wolve, or we could use the Polish, present day Polish street name, which I can't pronounce, but there it is on the slide, Walowa Street. Thank you. Yes, it's a V. Valova. Valova, yeah, it sounds like Volova in Yiddish. It's Polish. I cannot pronounce the L with a cross in it, sorry. But there's going to be a glossary.
Polish.
In translation.
In translation, keep the Polish spelling.
Yes.
So
I think the translation is going to use the present day modern Polish spelling of the street name, at least where we are right now. That's what we're going to do. These decisions are all in process and could change. There will also be a glossary to the volume, and that's going to help a lot.
if you could just take a minute or two more to finish up, because we're running a little over time at this point.
Sorry?
We're running a little over time.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry. People's names and titles. I'm almost done actually here. I'm going to skip the Roja bit, but you can see that names have different spellings, different connotations. What do we do? The Polish title, often translated as Mr. or Mrs. Pan or Pani. Are we going to keep the Polish or translate them into English? Probably keep the Polish, but we don't know. And finally, anything to do with a courtyard, which sounds very grand to English ears, but there's no good equivalent in English. They were not very grand things in Singer's Yiddish. And anything to do with an oven bed that just sounds hysterically funny in present day English. and I just included a picture here to show that, no, they're not bedding down on top of your standard kitchen range, but this is probably a rather grand oven bed for Singer's characters, but it's more or less what they use. So very briefly, just to end, what have we gained in translation? Translators themselves gained by making a meaningful contribution to the Yiddish, Polish, and American literary canons. Singer gains by having these new stories made available to a new generation of readers, academics, and researchers. I don't need to tell you a little old stories to translate, or sorry, to compare with the new stories, and general readers that I hope will also have access to this volume and be able to read more new Singer stories. So thank you for your attention, and I am going to stop screen sharing right now.